And our first speaker today is Richard Ekins on the enacted Constitution. I know most of you by sight. However, my sight, like my jump shot, is not what it used to be, and so I'm going to try to show your placard to me when you raise your hand to get on the queue. So, Richard, take it away.
Oh, thank you. I'm grateful to the conference committee organisers for inviting me here. I have to say they've taken a little bit of a risk. I think, and the introductions rather confirm, I'm probably the only person in the room never to have lived in a jurisdiction with a capital C constitution. So I either have no knowledge whatsoever of what I'm talking about, or a mind uncluttered by preconceptions. You can judge. So my perspective is that of a sort of Anglo-New Zealand lawyer with an interest in especially statutory interpretation, legislative action, but a broader interest in constitutional interpretation, which I've had to teach, notwithstanding the disability of my legal training, in Oxford for a graduate course in constitutional theory. And it seemed to me from afar and from my acquaintance with literature that there looks to be a pretty obvious connection between legislative action, constitution making, statutory interpretation, constitutional interpretation. And the paper looks to explore this, looking to understand the Constitution, capital C, as a kind of legislative act. Now, I have to say, as it says in the paper, I'm not really endeavouring to understand any particular constitution, but I try to work through the argument in relation to Australia to some extent, and also the United States. So I'm going to pass over rather rapidly what I have had in my mind as the first part of the paper, which is sections 2 through 4, which begin really with a plea for trying to understand interpretation, not by reflecting on the nature of interpretation in general, but by thinking about the lawmaking act, which is the subject of interpretation. And then sections 3 and 4, a quick outline of how I think it's productive to understand the lawmaking act that is legislation or legislating. And I deal with this at much greater length elsewhere. It's just an outline in the paper of the argument that the way to understand legislating is as a kind of intentional action, an exercise of agency, a choice as to what the law should be, how the law should be changed, a choice made in response to reasons. So it's an action, legislating, that requires agency. It requires a capacity to make choices, to reason, choose, to form and convey intentions. That's my argument. And the argument further is that legislative assemblies, if they're well formed, well structured, are capable of exercising that capacity. They have that agency. And they have it because it's the jointly intentional action of the many legislators, and they're structured in order to form themselves into a kind of agent capable of forming and acting on intentions in the act of lawmaking. So that's the argument insofar as it concerns legislating in general. And what I have in mind is sort of part 2 of the paper, sections 5 through 7, attend to the relationship between legislative acts and the Constitution. The Constitution with a small c. And this distinction will be familiar to many of you, maybe to all of you. But the Constitution in the small c sense is the set of rules, norms, principles that frame, constitute and limit public power. So the Constitution in one sense is a practice, a tradition of government, a tradition that includes fundamental customs, particular legal rules of a variety of sources, and also non-legal rules. And the Constitution, in this broad, rather capacious sense, might well include, in fact, in most or maybe all jurisdictions, does include particular legislative acts, ordinary legislation, as you might call it, enacted by an ordinary legislature. And these particular legislative acts have a constitutional significance, both in terms of their content as particular legal rules, but also a broader significance in the part they play, the weight they have in the broad tradition, as I've been referring to it. I give some examples of constitutional statutes as they've come to be termed in the United Kingdom, constitutional statutes from the United Kingdom, but also provisionally or tentatively some in the United States. And these statutes seem to me, reasoning partly from the structure of legislative authority, but also from the British experience, fall to be understood like other statutes, which is to say they fall to be understood by inferring the intended meaning, the lawmaking choice promulgated by Parliament, by Congress, whatever the legislature's termed, at the time of enactment. And there's a standing judicial temptation to treat these statutes differently. There's a temptation that has been present to the British courts over the last however many years, the last 15 years in particular perhaps, where the court is encouraged to or considers construing the statute not by, and on the ordinary way, by focusing on the intended meaning conveyed at the time of enactment, but instead treating the constitutional significance of the statute as relevant to its interpretation, in the sense of expressly saying sometimes we need to interpret this as if it were a constitution, so generously, liberally, without as much regard as we otherwise would do for the precise choice having been made and conveyed at enactment. It's a temptation though that, if one looks at the case law from Britain, is in the round resisted, and I think for good reason. These are statutes enacted by exercise of ordinary legislative authority. They're intended to have a certain consequence for the law, and the judges, by and large, have given it that have given those statutes that significance, and not gone beyond those bounds. So it looks to me as if the Constitution, again small c, is a broad practice, it's a tradition, but a tradition punctuated by deliberate legislative acts, where the legislature introduces particular legal rules into the corpus of law, which then frame and limit the tradition in certain ways. And that analysis of legislative acts by way of constitutional statutes seems to me to hold also when what's enacted is a capital C constitution, so a more comprehensive codification of some or many particular rules of constitutional law, where the whole set is in some way entrenched. And in very many communities, especially in the British Commonwealth, the constitution in that jurisdiction was enacted by an ordinary legislative act, so by a legislature exercising its ordinary, if plenary, legislative authority to change the law. And the constitution's adopted by the subjects of the law, by that particular community, precisely because and to the extent that it was chosen by a legislature with authority so to choose. And like other statutes, its meaning, its legal effect is to be found by focusing on inferring the lawmaking decision, the legal meaning conveyed at the time of enactment. Well, that may or may not hold for constitutions enacted as ordinary statutes, like the Australian Constitution. What about, though, constitutions that plainly haven't been or weren't enacted by an ordinary legislature, by an exercise of ordinary legislative authority? Well, here there seem to be some plausible reasons to doubt the mode of thought that says the Constitution's a legislative act, understand it as such. And I divide these in sections 8 through 10 of the paper into two broad types. And the first type of doubt really goes to the question of whether it's plausible to think of the Constitution as anyone's authoritative choice. So was there an exercise of authority to create the Constitution, and was there anyone doing any choosing? So was the Constitution maker exercising authority, and was the Constitution maker forming and acting on authority, forming and acting on intentions, excuse me. Well, taking the American Constitution, from my limited knowledge, it seems there's no antecedent authority to enact, to promulgate the Constitution. And yet it looks, to my mind, I don't think this is a particularly crazy thought, as though there's an attempt to exercise authority, attempt to make a choice as to what the new set of rules should be. An attempt that is recognised, adopted by the putative subjects of the authoritative act. In which case there is an exercise of authority, notwithstanding the lack of an antecedent legal foundation for the authority. Now, it's true that the ratifying conventions and so forth don't continue thereafter, I think, and you can correct me, they don't continue to enjoy an ongoing control over the content of the law in the way that a legislature does in respect to statutes within its jurisdiction. But that doesn't bear on the analysis, I think. Once propositions of law are introduced into some continuous polity, some political community, they persist until they're amended or repealed at some later time by exercise of authority at that time. Well, what about the more general doubt? The Constitution makers may have made the Constitution, but they didn't act on intentions. They didn't act in the way a legislature acts, assuming I'm right about how legislatures act in general. Well, it seems to me the making of the Constitution is a jointly intentional act. It didn't happen by accident, hard to understand it otherwise than as an attempt to change what the law should be. to change the way the polity is framed by law. Well, that might be true, but the doubt in question might have a more particular focus, which concerns whether there are intentions that go to the specific content of the law that's being made. Are there intentions concerning the meaning to be conveyed or the choice as to what the law should be? And the doubt, I think, goes along the lines that, yes, it's an intentional act, this law being made deliberately, but no intentions going to how or precisely what law should be made. And one sees exactly this worry in the literature on legislating and statutory interpretation, the so-called minimal intention argument of Joseph Raz and John Gardner. And now it seems, to my mind, rather odd and not a good account of the exercise of authority to take the participants in an act of constitution making to intend to enact some black box called the Constitution. Rather, if they know their business, if they're acting intelligibly, they'll be intending specific lawmaking choices, specific changes. Well, I won't trouble you with my amateur attempt at explaining the jointly intentional act of making the Constitution. It's there in the paper, and doubtless it needs considerable revision. I'll pass over quite quickly this next ground of doubt, which goes to the question, or rather makes the point, even if the promulgation of the Constitution is a legislative act, isn't it rather a strange legislative act? Isn't it a very unusual one, an odd context, particularly unusual purposes perhaps, much more far-reaching and abstract? Something to both those claims, but overstated, I think. Now, more significant might be the fact that if the Constitution is a legislative act, unlike ordinary statutes, it doesn't take its place within a structure where it's subject to ongoing legislative revision and choice. And that might make it a bad legislative act. It might be that the rationale for legislation is precisely that it's subject to this ongoing rational control. Very quick assertion in relation to consequences for interpretation. If this analysis is plausible, good reason to approach the Constitution like a legislative act. Look for the intended meaning being conveyed, the reasoned choice being made. Read the text in its context as the choice of an agent capable of making somewhat coherent, somewhat rational choices. I've said that there's good reason to read this, to approach the Constitution analogously to legislative acts. Two ways in which one might not want to, or might be make a reason not to. I've argued elsewhere that actually the focus on legislative intent and statute interpretation doesn't entail a focus on legislative history. There are good reasons to think otherwise in relation to the Constitution. There are reasons to be interested in a practice of equitable interpretation in relation to statutes, and that might hold in relation, maybe even with more force in relation to the Constitution. But there are particular problems in trying to think through equity in relation to the Constitution that might make that project just untenable. And that's where I'll stop and wait to see what Fred has to say.